network security, and we're going to try to get about 2 hours that we talked about at the bar last night collapsed down to less than 50 minutes. So please bear with us. We'll be going through some of the material kind of quickly, and we'll try to take questions at the end. If you have a question in between, we'll certainly take that, but if we're short on time, we might just move forward to make sure we get through everything. So our panelists here, go back. Chris Wysopal from Veracode, and we've got Steve Christey from MITRE Corporation, Bob Martin, also from MITRE, H.D. Moore, Rapid7, John Klein, Broadridge Financial Solutions, and Kelly Todd, representing OSBDB. So these are basically the life cycle areas we want to get through. If you saw Marianne Davidson's keynote this morning, she talked about secure development life cycle, and in a perfect world, we wouldn't even be talking about vulnerability management because everybody would be doing all of that and it would all work perfectly and there'd never be a vulnerability, and anybody who believes that, you know, right. So these are what we see as the basic stages and life cycle of vulnerability management. Back in the 80s, I was a system administrator at Bell Labs. We ran a program called COPS, which was very controversial at the time. It was a hacking tool. And what COPS really did was just looked at some basic configuration and file permission stuff. It didn't have a database of plugins like sophisticated scanners do now. And scanning is great, but it's only one part of the whole thing. If you think that's managing your vulnerabilities, you're missing a huge part of it. So what we're going to try to do is talk about the different phases: vulnerability discovering, private vulnerability sharing, public disclosure, vulnerability database management, which our friends from MITRE and OSBDB talk about, vulnerability monitoring and testing, and remediation. So, sorry if I'm talking fast, we have a lot to get through. Everybody on this panel has a really broad range of experience, but for the sake of having a decent discussion, we're kind of pigeonholing people into different roles so that they can talk about that particular aspect of it. Jonathan Klein is a senior vice president at Broadridge Financial Solutions. He's got the headache of trying to manage vulnerability for a large organization. So he's going to be representing our end user organization and managers. But before that, John was a consultant, so he's had lots of different experience in this area. Bob Martin with MITRE is also going to be talking about end user organizations, but also tool vendors dealing with some of the vulnerability information that comes along. We have Chris Wysopal talking about the application developers and application research point of view, since that's where his focus is right now. And I'm sorry, I can't see because of that. HD from the zero-day perspective from vulnerability researchers. Steve Christey with the fire hose of what they deal with at MITRE, and Kelly Todd, who's got the perspective of trying to manage the open source vulnerability database. So, for vulnerability discovery, at this point, vulnerability discovery is going to be involving people from the end user organization, the vulnerability researchers, and the application researchers. So I'm going to start with John. In your organization, you'd be doing monitoring for anomalies and various things to see what's different. So
yeah, I spend a lot. Well, my group spends time, trolling through the various news groups, whatever the vendors send out to us. We've been engaging vendors who deal with threat modeling and actually, start looking at anomalies so we can get ahead of the curve. It's a pretty big job of trying to keep track of all the different vulnerabilities because we run on very diverse platforms, anything from open systems like Windows and Unix all the way up to mainframes. So big challenge, a lot of expense.
And sometimes an organization like that will bring in somebody like Chris, who would be specifically looking at their homegrown applications. And what are some of the challenges you've seen in this area?
Yeah, so one of the things in Veracode, where I work, is also a software company itself. So we have to deal with eating our own dog food and managing our own software we're creating. And if you're building software, you also have to think about monitoring the sources of code that you're coming from. No one writes software from scratch. People use libraries, people use frameworks, people use third-party components in there. So one of the things we have to do is monitor if there's any vulnerabilities in third-party libraries that we shipped in our product or are planning on putting into our product. So we have to think about it from that perspective and think about testing the code that we're taking in. So we're doing a little bit of vulnerability discovery ourselves. This is part of our part of our development process. And of course, from a SDLC perspective, you want to discover the vulnerabilities as you're hopefully building the code.
Okay. And HD, with the Metasploit framework, I'm sure you have a few things to say on this subject.
Sure. A lot of folks talk about how testing engineering networks can be somewhat of a challenge because engineers tend to be set in their ways about what they do. Rapid7 is a huge engineering base, huge engineering pool, and because of that, as a CSO, I have to come through and make sure our audits are done properly, our bugs are actually fixed, all that. We take a little bit different approach than a lot of organizations in that my view on things is if it crashes when I'm testing it, it should have been patched. So we take a much more violent approach to vulnerability testing than I think a lot of organizations do or can get away with. So my view is a little bit skewed on that. Generally, when we start doing internal audits on the Rapid7 network, we start just hitting every exploit against every target, and if something falls over, we go patch it. So it's a different approach to vulnerability management and vulnerability assessment, and it makes sure that everything that we have internally is rock solid, or we find out about it much quicker. So the problem with vulnerability management solutions in general is you tend to have a lot of false positives when you don't have authentication on the targets, and the problem with exploits is they tend to be somewhat destructive and tend to take things out. So we're still trying to find the right balance internally for the right way to do that type of testing, and externally, of course, we also provide nice, secure, reliable, automated, safe vulnerability testing.
Okay, now once a vulnerability is discovered, HDL propose to you too. Your typical vulnerability researcher, not necessarily you or your company, but your typical vulnerability researcher generally finds something and is often posting to security lists, or where do you see them their first actions or that sort of thing?
The beginning of kind of the vulnerability life cycle is what I find the most interesting. A lot of times, the Metasploit development team, for example, is working on bugs between 24 hours and 48 hours before anyone else really sees them or cares about them. Generally what happens is we hear reports about 0-day, we try to find the sample in the wild, we reproduce in the lab, we get an exploit out, and we move on to the vulnerability management and vulnerability testing side. In terms of how researchers approach this problem, I think a lot of folks generally have an intent to work with the vendor. It's only when the vendor has burned them so many times that they decided just to start posting stuff to the mailing list. I know Kelly could probably go into more detail about the stats, the numbers he's seeing in terms of how that split plays out in the real world, but I think we're seeing a bigger trend towards full disclosure now than we have before.
The next one. So, and often you'll have, before it gets posted to lists, you'll have some private vulnerability sharing, some of the underground lists, and often this will generate additional research because you might have a guy who found something, little exploit in some piece of code he posted to a list, but somebody who's got a little bit more experience or better hacker or whatever, will do additional research based on that and could find an expanded impact to that particular vulnerability. And often we've got 0-day exploits that are out there for a couple of years. Often people wonder, like, well, why are you worried about not having services that you don't need? There's no vulnerability known for it. Well, not that we know necessarily, and that's why you need to protect on things like that. Steve, you had a comment on, oops, I broke the internet, so.
Yeah, if you find a vulnerability that's something along the lines of, finding a fundamental protocol flaw or a cryptographic algorithm issue, or any kind of design level problem in a very popular network protocol or file format or something along those lines, someone who finds it may not be thinking in terms of the large scale impact that they might have. They might just be thinking about, oh, I found this little problem in this one product. But then you wind up getting entire classes of products, dozens, hundreds of vendors that all wind up being affected. And if it's an individual researcher who's the one who's found this, they don't have the knowledge or the expertise to really get it fixed entirely. And that's where the classic organizations such as CERT really can come into play, and that's where some of their big strengths are. However, as you might imagine, doing all of that kind of coordination can take a long amount of time. You'll have some vendors that may be all set and they're ready to fix something right away, and then other vendors that still need